Is free speech really a useful idea, or an idea that seemed good because it permitted some to not have to justify what they say and others to not feel responsible for holding irrational persons to account? If free speech is an unmitigated good, then anyone can say anything to anyone at any time in any place. But this is just as irrational and impossible as no free speech. But this issue is not speech because context is everything. The real issue is debate, or more succinctly, response. No one honestly can tolerate free speech, nor can anyone truly make a good argument for it. No one serving coffee ought to be expected to tolerate a never-ending diatribe from her customers. No business ought to be expected to have its workforce singing ditties using foul language throughout the workday, or even heavily idiomatic language during business meetings. In practice, free speech only exists to the degree it does is because there are so few of us willing to abuse the right. Setting aside the claim that anyone wishes to have unfettered free speech or that anyone would tolerate it, what we find is that the real issue is the right to respond to the speech of others. Few if any see the need or right of the state to restrict a person's right to respond to the speech of others. If one person has a right to say unlimited migration is a good thing, another has the right to list all the things that disprove the claim. If one person can claim there are multiple genders and they can be selected for at random, then the rest of us have a right to show how unsound such beliefs are. Even if we agree speech cannot be permitted in specific instances on specific topics, if the topic is broached, there must be a right of response given to those who dispute whatever the proposition is that has been introduced. Society does not generally permit arguments to be made in favor of sex with minors, but when an offender is discovered, it opens up the door to explain why the accused is criminally responsible. In the debate regarding sexually explicit images in schoolbooks and the use of drag queens to read children's books to primary school-aged kids, the debate was not done with children nor during school hours in front of kids. There is a place for debates to take place, and not every place where people can talk is a place where every issue is open for debate. Starting this debate from the position that free speech is the standard is hypocritical at best, as no one truly thinks it is the standard. We do not have to explain why yelling fire in a theater is not a good idea. In fact, if our starting position requires us to debate and justify that which we all know to be true, we have started from the wrong position. Why do we claim we have free speech when we know that we object to some forms of speech? Even when we are politically in favor of free speech, we know we are resigned to the fact speech has to be limited in some cases. No sane person will tolerate sexualized language being directed at kids. Not to say some people who have a mental condition do tolerate this to some degree. But even when certain speech is allowed, it might need to be justified. Sometimes in legitimizing speech its defenders get almost apologetic, in that they understand how troublesome the situation is but accept the negative to support the principle. The right of free speech is, therefore, not a right at all. It's an ideal that often requires restraint. Like all ideals, it is unrealistic in application. Perhaps the problem lays in how we view speech. Yelling fire in a crowded theater is not truly speech, at least it is not the speech we envision when we posit the right of free speech. The same goes for the indoctrination of youth into drugs or premarital sex. What we ought to have a right to is free debate. Speech ought to be seen as engagement, or discussion, not a unidirectional barrage of words. Cursing people comes under the heading of aggression or assault. It is not speech in any rational conception of language. We need dialogue, not rhetoric. Free speech ought to be protected when it occurs within the context of an exchange of words. A heated debate provides cover for the use of unsavory words and language. The objective is to avoid these kinds of interactions, but if one chooses to engage in diatribes, then one must accept the consequences. In other words, free speech ought not cover invective, that is instigations. One is not permitted to instigate identity-based attacks. Abusive terms and racial slurs cannot be used other than in the setting of a debate, and then only if the terms of the debate permit this. In short, free speech is better considered free debate. In public negative identitarianisms, that is words and phrases that throw aspirations of a person or group of persons because of a physical attribute or their political or religious position, need to be avoided. Slurs that apply to humans without any identity marker being referenced, such as fool or crass, are permitted. In other words, free speech is an unrealizable ideal, and to persist in advocating for it whilst imposing restrictions on it, pleases no one. Free speech is permitted only in places and at times where a debate is possible within terms acceptable to both parties. The state cannot dictate acceptable terms for a debate, for adults. Other than in a debate, speech is limited to that which excludes unflattering terms based on identity. One person ought not be permitted to harangue another out in the open, that is, in a social environment. On the other hand, a person ought to be free to make speeches and conduct meeting without uninvited guests. This position is not that different from yelling fire in a crowded theater. We do not make negative identitarian attacks or comments about race, religion, or sex out in the open, that is, in spaces that are not contained and targeted as to audience. It is less about speech and more about location. The public arena does not make a person a target. No racial slurs ought to be permitted in public forums, that is, in unrestricted public spaces. The more public and the less restricted the space, the more circumspect ought to be our language. The more contained the space and the more controlled the audience, the freer speech ought to be. This actually fits in with our policy in other areas, such as sex. In privacy or in consenting groups of adults, everything is permitted that the participants are permitting. Those who do not consent need the freedom to exclude themselves. However, we do not allow unrestricted sexuality in open forums where there are no restrictions on age or personal preference. People ought not be permitted to force their morality or lack thereof onto others. Much of the policy we use to address the issue dealing with age of consent can be utilized in the issue of free speech. The two issues are not disconnected. Free speech in the context of debate in an environment in which debate can proceed, circumspect speech in areas in which privacy cannot be expected. Circumspect speech applies to identity, that is race, religion, and sex. One ought not be stereotyped by the use of a negative association with one's race, religion, or sex. If one's religion, race, or sex is given a negative stereotypical valuation, that negative cannot be attached to an individual of that race, sex, or religion. If the religion is associated with terrorism, is not grounds to accuse any and every member of that religion of terrorism. The accusation that a religion is a terrorist group can be debated in an appropriate venue but not used as a slur against every person in that religion. Open venues call for restricted speech, just as it calls for restricted activity. We cannot shoot off our guns in urban areas, nor can we shoot off our mouths in crowded subways.